Hey guys, I'm Erin and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm talking about my most disappointing reads of 2021. Hey guys, I'm Erin and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm doing my most disappointing reads of 2021. So just to be clear, this is not a worst I read in 2021. There are definitely some books that would make the worst of lists that are not on this list just because I didn't really have expectations going into them. And there's some books on this list that would not make it worse because while I didn't love them, they weren't awful. They were just disappointing based on what I expected. So I have 8 total books on this list. So these are just in the order I read them. I did not rank them from most disappointing to least disappointing because I find ranking things, especially when there's a mix of genres, hard, and so I just didn't want to. So we're just doing them in the order that I read them, starting with the first one, which is The Hating Game by Sally Thorne. This one I did genuinely dislike and did not think was a good book. I was very excited to read this. This kind of, I feel like in the romance book circles, seems to be like held up as like the shining example of good enemies to lovers contemporary romance of the recent years, or good traditionally published of the recent years. It's one of the cartoon covers. It's been on for a few years now, and it just feels like one of those ones that's like everyone loves. It's like one of the most recommended, kind of like, you know, Sanderson on fantasy subreddits, recommended all the time. I feel like that's where The Hating Game fits in the romance community, contemporary romance community at least, recommended and loved. And I didn't like it. I was so disappointed because I was so excited for it, and I just didn't like it. I, one, don't really click with Sally Thorne's writing style very much. It just, her writing style is very discombobulated and confusing. Like, I just don't think she's very good at writing. Like, she might be one of the only authors I've ever read and genuinely just didn't think was very good at writing at a base level. That's something I pretty much never say about any book I read. And this one, I just didn't feel like she was. I was constantly confused in scenes. I'd be like, literally, what just happened in this scene? And when you're reading, like, a fluffy romance, it shouldn't be confusing. Like, I'm not reading some, like, super dense philosophical text that you really have to like absorb and read slowly. No, this is a contemporary romance. It should not be hard to figure out what is happening in a scene, and that happened very frequently. So that was not great. And then the amount of times this book reminded you about the height difference was way too many. I also found the banter, like the hating game, that was like what they called it, like their workplace banter was like referred to as like their hating game, so unprofessional. Like, they did it at work and it was just too far. Like, it was way too far, incredibly unprofessional for two people who are supposedly up for like a pretty big and like high level promotion. I just like couldn't handle it. And so there's one thing towards the end, slight spoiler, so we'll put a spoiler warning just in case you care. We find out the hero has painted, well, I think it was one of the rooms in his apartment, like the specific shade of blue. I think it was blue. But either way, the shade of color he chose matched our heroine's eye color. It was supposed to be this super cute, but he did this before they liked each other. Like, he did this back when they like actively hated each other at work, or at least she actively hated him, and it was supposed to be kind of cute, but I just thought it was creepy. Like, it was just creepy. So, not into this one. There were like 1 or 2 scenes I did enjoy, but overall, not a fan. Do not understand why this one is so beloved at all. So, the next book I read is also a romance. This is historical romance, and it is To Sir Philip with Love by Julia Quinn. What a disappointing Bridgerton book. I overall really enjoyed the Bridgerton series, but this one was just bad. Like, Eloise deserved so much better than the hero she got, and that was the main problem, was I abhorred the hero. I think of all the romance books I read last year, Philip is like my #1 most hated hero from all of the books I read. I haven't gone through and actually considered it, but I think he would be if I went through all the books. He was just the worst. Like, I think, like, so Julia Quinn kind of set up his kind of character arc to be him kind of figuring out how to be a good father, because he was a widower and his wife had died and left him with 2 kids. But the problem was, instead of setting up the beginning of his arc for him to be kind of struggling, which is completely understandable that he was struggling to raise these kids when his wife had died, because especially in the times, it was probably more normal that the wife did most of the child rearing and he wasn't really involved in a lot of the day-to-day like minutia. Like, I get that. And so he kind of fish out of water, and that's kind of part of the setup, is he wants a wife to help take care of the kids, which is fine. Now that's fine, and I definitely understand, like, he obviously is gonna have trouble coping with losing a wife and now having these 2 kids to raise anyways. But the way she set it up, instead of being the sympathetic character that you kind of feel for, she just his like fathering abilities at the beginning were so negligent. He was completely unlikable and unredeemable in my eyes. Like, he was just so bad and negligent towards his two kids. It wasn't like bumbling father trying to do his best but not really there. It was like just straight negligence, and like that was too much, and I hated him because of that. And he just like couldn't turn it around. Like, every time he had this revelation about him being a bad father at a certain time, he didn't do anything to like address that. He would just go run away and hide in his greenhouse. And I was like, so over it. I really hated him. I also really disliked the way this book talked about his late wife's depression. It very much gave off a vibe of depressed people aren't worthy of love. Like, that was never said, and I don't know if that's what she intended the message to be read as. I really hope not. This book is almost 20 years old, and I mean, I know views on mental health have changed a lot since this was written, but I really hope that's not what she intended, but it's how it came off, and I really dislike that. The only thing that saved this book from being a 1-star read was the cameo of the Bridgerton brothers was excellent and amazing, and I loved that part because I love them. So, very disappointing book in an otherwise good series. Next was a sci-fi book, A Big Ship at the Edge of the Universe by Alex White. And I said I didn't rank these, but if I did rank them, this would be the one that was the least disappointing in this list, purely because this is a book club book and I had not heard of it prior to it being chosen as the book club book. So I didn't really have a ton of hype built up from hearing lots of good reviews. It wasn't one I've been looking forward to reading for a super long time. But the hook of it and the very beginning of the book were enough to convince me immediately that I was going to love it, that when I didn't, it was so disappointing. Like, the kind of the synopsis on the back made me think it was going to be very Firefly vibes, and I adore the show Firefly. It's one of my favorite TV shows. Here for anything with Firefly vibes, and so I thought it was going to be that. And so the first chapter of the book also opened up with a space racing scene, like Formula One style racing, and I love racing. I love Formula One. I love NASCAR. The pod racing in this first Star Wars episode is like one of my favorite parts of the Star Wars series. What can I say? Love it. And so I started with that, and I was like, heck yeah! And then that was the high point. I did like parts of this book, and I think that played into some of the disappointment was the kind of treasure hunting aspect of this book, which I was expecting from the synopsis. I really did like that storyline, but unfortunately that was weighed down by the fact that I really didn't like the main character. I found her annoying. I didn't want to root for her. I liked the secondary characters, but never felt attached to them enough to overcome my dislike of our main character. There was also a villain that felt very haphazardly thrown in, and a main romance that felt very shoehorned in. So all these negative elements to me just kind of outweighed the core storyline I did enjoy, which is unfortunate. Overall, not a horrible book. I gave it a 3-star. It was fine, but I just started the book thinking I was going to adore it, and then just thought it was fine, which is disappointing. Next is The Crown of Gilded Bones by Jennifer L. Armentrout. This is the third book in the From Blood and Ash series, and it came out in April. I pre-ordered the ebook. I started reading it immediately. Was very excited for it. I really liked the first book. The second book was not quite as good, but still good. And then I was hoping the third one would pick back up, little book syndrome kind of deal with the second, and it just didn't. It just wasn't good. So what I think the problem was, what I really liked about the first book was the romance. This is the first book read as romance first, fantasy second. I would put it on a romance shelf over a fantasy shelf if I had to choose. I know my local bookstores shelve it in the romance section versus fantasy. So the romance is what got me there, and so because I was reading it as a romance book, the kind of background fantasy, I didn't care as much about how good it was. And then the third book, the romance was just big thumbs down. At this point, the main characters were together, which, spoilers, sorry, and they had no chemistry anymore. It was as soon as they got together, all the spark was gone. They had no chemistry. They had the same 2 conversations the entire 600-page book. And our male hero lost all his personality around the heroine in this book. It was the only thing he did was look at the heroine with hard eyes and said, "Yes, dear, I love you." And it was just I don't want to read about this. And so then, once the romance and the tension and the chemistry was gone, I was left with the fantasy part, and the fantasy part wasn't good, which was completely excusable in book 1 when I was reading it as a romance, when there's no romance that's compelling, and now I'm kind of just reading it as a fantasy, and the fantasy isn't good. Just disappointing. It was just not great world building. It was very info dumpy for a third book in a series. The world building to me felt very confusing, and again, third book in the series and things weren't starting to click at all. Very off-putting. It also, This series was supposed to be a trilogy, and at some point she changed it to 6 books, and it was very clear in this book that that decision had been made, like, right before she wrote it, because nothing happened in this book. I felt like she only wrote it because she needed to drag it out into 6 books, so she, like, made, like, one thing happen so that she could get another book out instead of, like, condensing it. So, yeah, we're definitely not continuing the series after this one. Like, we're done, and I was very disappointed that I was so excited for this one. Next is another fantasy sequel, and that is All the Tides of Fate by Adeline Grace. So I read the first book last year and really enjoyed it. It was just this fun pirate fantasy adventure with this, like, group of, like, friends, and I enjoyed that. And this one lost all the magic. It wasn't really the same kind of pirate adventure the first one was, and in this one, while we did have, like, one main character in the first book, it really felt like while she was the main character, the people surrounding her, like her pirate gang, were also equally the focus. And this one, it really narrowed in on just her, which could have been fine, but I just wasn't with her with some of the decisions she was making. Like, one thing was she got really hung up on this one detail of something happening in this book, and I was just like, this thing you're hung up on is just not as big of a deal as you were making it out to be. Just wasn't. I just didn't think it was nearly as big of a deal as she did, so I was just so exhausted with her being hung up on it. And then the second thing was, about halfway through the book, she has this, like, faced with this kind of decision where she could do option A or option B. And one of the options had some very emotional nature to it, and so I understood, like, her stopping to consider both and thinking about it. But also, it was very, very clear which option was right. There was a clear right option and a clear wrong option. So after that first debate, which was fine, I was like, okay, now you know which one to take. And yet she didn't. She just debated it over and over again. Very tired. Very exhausting to revisit when I was just like, there's no debate here. There's really not. There's very clearly one answer. The other thing about this one that was it just felt like a sequel that didn't need to happen. It's not very long, and the first book is similarly length, and there was like you really could have shortened this to just the couple of chapters that wrapped up some of book 1 and just put it in book 1 as a standalone. This did not need to be a full sequel at all. I really didn't think it did. I think you could have just made book 1 4 or 5 chapters longer and been done with it. And yeah, definitely disappointed because I pre-ordered this. And it's always a bummer when you pre-order something and it's just fine. So again, another one that wasn't awful, just fine, which was disappointing. Next, I have Under the Whispering Door by TJ Klune. I have a full video review of this one, so I'll try to keep my thoughts on this short, and you can see my extended thoughts in that video. But I was disappointed in this because I really enjoyed The House in the Cerulean Sea. I read that over the summer and then got this art not long after, and was like, heck yeah, another one, let's go. And then this one was just mostly boring. It's just mostly boring. I liked the very beginning and very end, and the rest of it was just boring. I did not really like the two main characters enough to make up for how boring the plot was during all that time. I just never got connected to our Wallace, our main character, and then our, like, tea shop guy was just kind of like a walking therapist catchphrase machine, and I just wasn't into it. And so thus, I was just bored for most of this book, which is very disappointing, because I was really hoping it to be a nice, cute, heartwarming read, like Cerulean Sea, and it just wasn't. Next is The Bombay Prince by Sujata Massey. This is the third book in the Perveen Mystery series, and I read the first two at the beginning of 2020 and loved them, following an Indian lawyer and then a female Indian lawyer in the 1920s as she solves mysteries. And so this one was disappointing, one, because the writing didn't work for me. It felt very stilted, and I was kind of sitting there wondering, I was like, is this how the writing was in the first two? Have my taste just changed in a year and a half? Or is this one just written differently? I'm not sure. I'm kind of afraid to, like, look at the first two and find out, because they have such fond places in my memory. Other than that, though, I could have, like, pushed through that, but this one also, this is going to be a theme for this, from the last one, this one, and the next one, it was just kind of boring. The murder, or the death that happened, that was the main investigative piece of this book, happened early in the book, but the investigating of it didn't start till, like, halfway through. And between the death and that halfway point, nothing happened. It was just them futzing around between a hotel and, like, the law offices, and that was it. Really nothing happening. So bored. So bored. If I didn't love the first two in this series so much, I probably would not have pushed through. But once the investigating happened, I enjoyed the investigating of the murder, but it also only took up, like, 5 total chapters. I was like, the rest of it was just kind of boring. I just don't like all the characters that we had in the first one, so there's some kind of, like, minor things I like, but it's kind of boring. it was disappointing. So, and the last one on this list is The Road Trip by Beth O'Leary. Beth O'Leary wrote The Flat Share, which I read in January. It was one of my favorite romance reads of the year. So this one, being just okay, was very disappointing. And as I said, there's a theme at the end of this video, and that I just thought it was boring. Like, most of the middle, like the end kind of got exciting, but the rest of it was just kind of boring. Like, it was a second chance romance where we had a past timeline from when they got together the first time, and then the current day where they were like meeting back up and like ended up together, because romance was really not a spoiler. But yeah, so the past storyline really felt like it was focusing more on why they broke up instead of like their romance. And so it kind of just convinced me, I'm like, oh yeah, y'all weren't good together. So I was like, why would I think you're good together now? And so then the present day storyline didn't really do much to convince me they would be good together now. Like, I just like never really felt the romance in the present day either. It's just kind of boring. It had kind of an exciting ending, but it was just fine. So yeah, those were my 8 most disappointing books I read in 2021. What was your most disappointing book? And if you read any of these and agree or disagree with what I've said, let me know in the comments. I definitely know some of these are well loved by some people, just not me, and that's okay. I will see you in my next video.